What's up everyone? In this issue of Motive Garage, our GT-R is back. Oh my God. Now you would have seen in our last Motive Garage on the R32 GT-R that it's back together and running again. Now once a new car is running, the first thing you need to do is run in the engine correctly. Now first up, all new engines need to have the rings bed in correctly. Essentially, you want to settle the rings into the bore and get a good seal. Now that's the reason why on a fresh engine you shouldn't idle the thing for very long. In fact, after first startup you should only idle it long enough to know that it runs, has oil pressure and doesn't leak. After that, shut it off, get it on the dyno and bed the rings in correctly. Now every workshop has a slightly different strategy of how they bed the rings in, but essentially you're just applying varying load that you step up from, 1500 RPM through to probably 3,000 or 4,000 RPM. You're not doing any full throttle stuff or anything like that and full RPM. You're just varying the load, trying to get some boost into it at low RPM and bed those rings in. Now, once the rings are bed in, there's two strategies you can have from here. Some workshops will tell you to go put some kilometers on your car and others will just, well, send it straight away. Full RPM, full power, get straight into it. Now, if your car is used for racing, well, of course, just send it. Bed the rings in, tune it, go. The workshops that tell you to do a certain amount of kilometers to bed the engine and even further are usually worried about the long-term life of that engine. They're not worried about the short term going racing and changing the rings and bearings every 18 months because the car makes so much power. That's more for cars that, you want them to actually do a lot of kilometers on that engine. Well, at least that's the theory of the workshops that do it. If you're going to run the car in, then you're going to limit RPM, boost and load, all of them. So with our car, CRD set the rev limit to 5,000 RPM and we ran the car on wastegate pressure, which is 14 PSI, but it does creep open. Now this enabled me to drive around and put varying load on the car, but not put a lot of high stress, high RPM driving on the car. Now what's important about running the car in isn't so much how many kilometers it did, and the boys will often say go do 1,000 kilometers. What is important is the amount of heat cycles the car goes through. Every heat cycle the car does is basically allowing the car to bed in a little bit better because every time it expands then contracts again, it settles into where it's going to be permanently, i.e. more heat cycles basically means the more it's going to settle like that. Now another reason to go and put kilometers on a fresh engine build is not just about running in the engine. I think it's a great idea because it enables you to test the entire car as a system without doing it with the risk of motorsport. So for example, do you have any coolant leaks, oil leaks? Is your cooling system coping with the car? Can it put up with peak hour traffic? Is the gearbox and clutch and diff all working correctly? Basically, you're testing the entire system of the car without being under undue stress to see if anything goes wrong. So driving this car around for a couple of weeks and putting it through sort of 50 heat cycles, I got to find out whether it could cope with peak hour traffic, whether the cooling system was working, brakes, clutch, everything. And I would rather something go wrong cruising around at 60 k's an hour than something go wrong at 150 miles per hour at the end of the drag strip. So running a car in isn't just about bedding the engine in, it's also about making sure the car works as well. Now, after getting the car back from CID to run in, I had a few little things I needed to sort out on the car first before I could put some Ks on it. I needed to get the Haltech IC7 dash working, and there was a whole bunch of new sensors that I wanted to install. To do this, I needed some new Haltech gear, including a wideband kit, thermocouple amplifier, CAN bus expanders, some CAN adapters to the I/O box, plus a new I/O box for the extra inputs, which basically be a range of their sensors. I installed all of the new Haltech gear alongside the Haltech Elite 2500 on a carbon panel to go under the dash, making things much neater than before. The new sensors being installed were EGTs in the exhaust manifold to measure exhaust gas temperature and variations between cylinders, an EGT in the intake pipe to measure ambient air temp the turbo is receiving, an exhaust back pressure sensor, a turbo speed sensor so we can use compressor maps more effectively, a pre-intercooler boost sensor so we can measure both pressure drop in the system and also use it to analyze the turbo compressor map correctly, and we added another oil pressure sensor so we now have one out of the block and one into the block, which is after the oil cooler and clear view filter. Once I had them all wired in, it was straightforward setting them all up in the Howtech software on the laptop. I simply cannot express just how vital it is to have all these sensors on your car. I didn't have them for a long time on this, but the main reason I put them on initially was so that I could test products on the car to give you guys better data, but then I realized every serious build should have the amount of sensors that this car has. So if you have the sensors and you have the data, you can really see what's going on with your car, not just change parts for the hell of it, you change them because you have to. So many reasons to have all these sensors. Yes, it's a fair bit of extra work and it's not cheap. It's a few $1,000s worth of extra sensors in this car, but if you're building a $50,000 engine and a $200,000 GT-R build, why wouldn't you spend a couple of grand on extra sensors? You may personally not know how to analyze it, but at least all the data can be logged and your tuner can take a look at it. So with all these sensors now installed in the car and the IC7 dash now working, I went off and put 100 kilometers on the car before giving it its first oil change. The oil used to run the car in was drained and inspected before we switched to Nulon Race Oil 10W60. It's the same oil that we've been using for quite a few years now, as it's designed for racing, high horsepower, and it's E85 compatible. We've always had great results. And 10W60 is the viscosity that we recommend to all RV owners, whether it's stock or 1500 horsepower. We also cleaned the clear view filter and then cranked the car over with no fuel or ignition to fill it up before starting the car up and heading off to do some running in.
Are you ready?
Ready.
So the reason we're out on country roads to bed the engine in is because when you drive a country road, you get to go through all the gears, you've got varying load as you go up and down hills, you've got varying RPM, and that's good for running the engine in. But if you sit on the freeway, well, you just do constant RPM. Plus, twisty roads are more fun.
Yeah.
Probably the biggest thing I want to find out as well while driving this now is how much does the extra weight over the front with the RB30 with concrete in it change the handling, and probably not enough to care with the type of car this is now, but you can feel it a little bit, but overall, it drives great.
With the engine now run in and the car checked over and working great, we hit the mainline hub dyno at Croydon Racing Developments, and things looked very promising very early. Wastegate pressure of just under 14 psi saw the car make 605 horsepower. That's up 70 horsepower from what the car used to make when it was a 2.6 litre on the same boost. So after a perfectly successful run-in period with our GT-R, things were looking pretty good, but GT-R life has struck again. Once we raised the rev limiter from 5,000 up to 9,000 where it should be, we started throwing alternator and power steering belts off the car. What can change the alignment of these things? Well, obviously different balances, different alternator kits, and then the different washers you use on the crank. before and after the timing gear can actually make the balancer sit slightly differently. Now, they all look good when you start them up, and they all look good at idle and 5,000 RPM, but you don't really find out how bad they are until 9,000 RPM. So today, I'm going to pull it all off and basically try and realign everything and get it working better. I am going to try some different pulleys, just so we can eliminate each issue one at a time until we find out what it is. Well, we're done on the dyno. For now, anyway. This is only stage one of the engine development and parts testing we're going to be doing on this 3.2 litre engine. Now, rather than push this turbo and engine combo right to the very edge and risk breaking it, because we would have some pretty big back pressure if we squeezed it as far as we could go, we picked a datum point of 22 PSI of boost because we had good data on the 2.6 on 22 PSI, and we basically just wanted to have a direct comparison. Essentially, we wanted to compare same boost, 2.6 versus 3.2, and then we also knew we could compare same power and then what the different boost would be between the 2.6 and 3.2. So we've tuned it so it's reliable, repeatable power on 22 PSI, and we can have a lot of fun with it. So let's go have a look at the dyno graph and talk about the power curve before we analyse the 2.6 versus the 3.2. So on 22 PSI with the air filter on in full street trim, exactly how we're going to drive it, it makes between 785 and 800 horsepower. Depends on heat soak, air temperature, etc. But that was the 5th run in a row and it made 791. Now I quickly want to talk about the power curve for this car and talk about the tuning philosophy that we took. Now, because it's a 3.2 with a G35, it has the ability to make a lot of boost very early. But what people don't always understand about RB26s and RB30s is they crush bearings if you make too much torque down low. So we were careful to minimise how much torque it could make. We could have probably had 35 pound and it's, you know, at 3.5 grand or 4 grand if we really wanted to. But Con's done a very progressive boost curve. So rather than just shoot straight to 22 PSI, it sort of goes up to 18 and sort of creeps up from there. And it actually helps make the power curve more linear. A lot of power curves with big turbos will sort of, you know, hit really hard, taper off and then fall over. Well, Con's purposely manipulated the boost and the power curve to just be a nice, linear, but also really meaty power band. And the reason for that is, one, it conserves the engine and stops it from having a lot of torque down low where you labour the engine. It basically means you keep the thing above 5 grand where it's happy. And the other reason is it's much more drivable. If it comes on boost too hard, too early, and a massive increase in torque, it unsettles the car, you get torque steer, and you can quite often get a lot of wheel spin, even in a GT-R. So by having a more usable power curve, it's going to make the car more drivable. Yes, it would probably feel faster if he made the thing slingshot to 30 pound at 4,000 or 4,500 RPM and then taper the boost back off again. You can do that in little turboed factory cars, but in a GT-R, you're just risking crushing the bearings and wearing the thing out really quickly. So we went for a really usable, drivable power band. In no way is this setup, honestly, really being pushed to its limit. We've looked at the turbo speeds, the exhaust back pressure, and made sure the car is still well in its efficiency range. We could make more power. We know we could probably go to 900 if we wanted to, but honestly, I just want on a power figure that I can drive around on, is repeatable, and we can get a lot of good data to test a bunch of products. But Before we get into the drivability, let's take a look at the dyno graph comparisons between the 2.6 setup and the 3.2 setup. Because just remember, the only thing that's changed is the actual engine itself. Everything around it is the same as before. Firstly, we have to point out that although the cars were dynoed in the same gear, the start speed and start boost are higher on the 2.6 graph. The 2.6 started its run at approximately 4,500 RPM and had a start boost of around 18 PSI and then revved to over 9,500 RPM, while the 3.2 litre started from 2,500 RPM with only 5 PSI. This means that we can really only compare from 4,500 RPM onwards on the dyno graphs, but on the street we'll find out very quickly what it's like below that. You can see the 3.2 litre doesn't rev as hard, but that's due to the turbo falling over, not the engine's abilities. This is why the red 3.2 graph looks different in scale to the blue 2.6 graph. Right from the start, the 3.2 litre has significantly more power and torque, an extra 100 kilowatts or 135 horsepower, and an extra 250 newton meters of torque. In the meat of the torque curve, the 3.2 litre has an extra 300 newton meters, and at peak torque, it's 1,008 versus 800 newton meters on the 2.6, and it's delivered over 1,000 RPM earlier. It's obvious the car has much more low down and mid-range torque, which will totally change its drivability, but it still revs to 8,500, giving it a massive power band. Now let's look at the 2.6 versus 3.2 comparison on the same power. The 2.6 made 797 on 29 PSI, and the 3.2 made 797 horsepower on only 22 PSI. Same deal, they were loaded up differently, but you can see instantly how much more low down and mid-range torque the 3.2 has. Although peak torque is only 100 newton meters different, 900 versus 1,008, in the mid-range, the 3.2 has as much as 300 newton meters more torque at one point. The power curve essentially looks like everything has been moved over 1,500 RPM. Basically, the 2.6 needed to be squeezed harder to make the same power, and the 3.2 means we now don't need to rev to 9,500 anymore. So for now, we're just revving to 8,500 with the G30 5050. We expected the 3.2 to make more low down and mid-range, but we're impressed by exactly how much. Now, it's time to see what it's like in the real world on our first test drive.
All right, this is no camera tricks, no editing tricks, no nothing. This is my legitimate first drive since we've got it off the run-in tune and have some power in it. So, let's go. Now, one of the disadvantages of having a 10-litre sump and a giant radiator is it does take a little while for the car to get up to temperature. So even after idling for 5, 6, 7 minutes, you jump in, your water temps are good, but your oil temp is still right down. So you do need to cruise for a little bit, but that's good because you still get temperature into the gearbox, temperature into the diff, and everything warms up. So slightly frustrating at times if you're in a hurry, but it's good for the car because you do need to warm everything up, get the juices moving. Now, one thing I love about the 3.2 is the ability to just drive it at 2,000 RPM. You really can just putt along at, you know, what's that, 1,800 RPM in fourth gear, and you can still drive along. Like, that's just makes for a really easy car to drive. And the extra capacity isn't just noticeable for making grunt easily, it's noticeable off boost, it's noticeable down low. And the 3.2 really does, I guess, change that character. You're so used to a GT-R being so revvy, but with this, yeah, you've got a little bit of low down torque. I mean, it ain't no 5 litre or anything, but you know, it's better than normal. One thing I love about the 3.2 is just how easy it is to drive. Even on part throttle, it gets on pretty quick. You don't need a whole lot of RPM to get it driving around nicely. Low down torque just transforms the car. I mean, I love the revvy nature of the 26, but here's the thing, this thing still revs to 8.5, more than a factory one. So it's not like I don't have RPM. So those people that think RB30s don't rev, yeah, well, maybe yours don't, but a Nitto Stroker 3.2 in a Croydon-built engine with a big head, it has both. It has low down torque and it has RPM. So might have a bit of road we can use. Here we go. All right, we're on 17 pound. Oh man, it is just too easy to go fast in this thing. All right, that was 17 pound. Let's try 20. Far out. That I actually hit rev limiter in first gear there, which I very rarely do. That thing just, man, once the party starts, it's on. That is so easy to get onto boost and get moving. All right, we're at, I don't know. All right, we're at 80. Back to fourth, back to third. Okay, we're at 4,000. And even on a short shift, that is fast. That is very, 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 very fast and very easy to drive fast. And here's the thing, the big turbo ones where you get a fight to get them on, they want to change lanes and move around. A GT-R on 700 to 800 horsepower, a legit 700 to 800 horsepower, is a weapon of a car with a sequential, but with the 3.2, it's so much easier. You don't have to worry about getting the thing on or how hard you're going to rev it or where you are in the power band. It's just so easy. And man, it flicks fast in first gear. Like I thought I'd feel the mid-range torque and fall over, but man, first gear revs like before. It wants to spin to 9 plus, but power falls over at 8.5. So we've just left it at 8.5 just to look after the car. But honestly, 20 pound of boost, which is about probably 750, 770 horsepower, is heaps for the street. That is so much fun and so easy. So easy to drive fast in such a well set up car. It's so good. I will say this, Con's tuning of this car is simply epic. I know we could make it feel more aggressive and feel torquey, but the way he's smoothed out the power curve makes the car so much more drivable. We can hook up in first gear on a roll-on on 800 horsepower. That's insane. And you can put the power down, you can use it. It's not as dangerous either. It doesn't want to move around heaps. Like, it's so usable, this thing. It doesn't drive like an RB26 with a big single turbo on it. It drives more like and maybe a high revving V8 is probably the best way to explain it, because instead of trying to make peak torque at 4.5, where we probably could, Con's made the boost much more progressive, and it doesn't make peak torque to more like 6, which is really where you want it in an RB26 based engine anyway. You don't want too much torque down low, it crushes bearings, wears things out, break gearboxes, break everything. So the way he's smoothed out the torque curve and smoothed out the power curve has just made this car a dream. Yes, it may not feel as fast as some other GT-Rs, but I can tell you right now, based on looking down at the speedo or looking down at the gear changes, or when we finally take it down the quarter mile, I can tell you right now, it's fast and it's good and it's easy to drive fast. What a weapon of a car. Honestly, if you're not in that I want to go to roll racing and beat everyone game with GT-Rs, or you just want to have a wicked street car, I just don't know how you can look past a 3.2 with like a G35 1050 or maybe the new G40 when it comes out, something that size, because it's just so drivable.
So the 2.6 versus 3.2 debate. Where do I sit now? Honestly, 3.2 all the way. I know the argument is that the 2.6 blocked with the 2.8 will rev harder and sound better, but honestly, I'm just not buying that. I get that a stock RB30 crank probably doesn't like to rev very hard, but once you've got a Nitto 3.2 in there, RPM's not an issue. I've said it before, Goat 32 revs to 11,500 RPM. Ours revs to 8.5 before the turbo falls over, but can definitely rev much harder once we have a bigger turbo. The sound, come on, man. This car sounds sick with a 3.2 or a 2.6. If you can tell the difference, you know, down to every little detail, fine. But the exhaust manifold and exhaust system are probably going to play more of a part in the sound than whether it's a 2.6 or a 2.8. Big RPM always sounds killer. For me, the 3.2 advantage is just purely the drivability and the fact that you don't need to punish the car to get the most out of it. If you rev your car to 10,000 RPM instead of 8,500 RPM, you're not reducing your engine life by 20%, you're probably halving your engine life. Big RPM is expensive, hard to make reliable, and just honestly wears the engine very quickly. By having a 3.2, we're able to have way more mid-range torque. You can actually have more fun in the car. You can short shift earlier, and you don't need to hit 110 k's an hour in first gear in one hit. You don't have to rev it as hard. So it's easier to drive normally, it's easier to drive fast, and it's just more accessible, usable power. And you just, in a street car, that's so important. So if you asked me, would I rather have a 3.2 that revs to 8.5 or a 2.8 that revs to 10.5? I'll take the 3.2 any day of the week. It is just a much better street car. Is it a better track car or circuit car? Well, that's up for you to decide with how you set your car up. But for me, a 3.2 is the ultimate in a street-driven or a drag setup style GT-R, because you have your low-down torque and your mid-range, but if built correctly, you still get your big RPM as well. So, where to next for our GT-R is probably your question. Well, I'm hoping I can enjoy the car for, I don't know, a week or two before we get back into it. But coming up with our GT-R, we're going to be testing an intercooler. Can a modern intercooler go head-to-head or beat a 20-year-old HKS intercooler we have on the car? Then we're going to be testing some inlet manifolds. We're going to test a Nismo inlet manifold. We're going to test another enlarged 6-throttle inlet manifold before we do a drive-by-wire single throttle manifold versus a 6-throttle manifold. Which one will win? Which one's better to drive? All the answers will be given to all the questions you've had of whether you should go single throttle in your GT-R. Once we've done that, we're going to fit the G45 1500 to the car, and the last test we're going to do is actually a pretty cool one. IEE in New Zealand have sent us their drive-by-wire 6-throttle kit, and they've also sent us some enlarged 48mm throttles. So we're going to be comparing an enlarged drive-by-wire 6-throttle to single throttle as well, but on a 1500 horsepower turbo, not on something little like this. So there's a whole lot of data to be had and a whole lot of testing to do with our GT-R, so make sure you subscribe so you don't miss out on any of our GT-R testing and development.